Today in the Senate there'll be a legislation committee looking at the government's draconian shipping legislation. This shipping legislation is designed to destroy the Australian shipping industry, and the evidence that's been put forward shows that this will destroy Australian jobs and mean that the Australian-based shipping industry simply cannot compete against foreign ships. The legislation does two things. Firstly, it removes any preference for Australian ships above foreign ships operating around our coast on domestic freight. Secondly, it ensures that those foreign ships competing side by side versus Australian ships for these jobs can pay foreign wages. That means that the Australian ships simply aren't competitive. You wouldn't allow an Australian truck travelling from Sydney to Melbourne along the Hume Highway for Toll or Linfox to have to compete with a foreign truck with Filipino standards, Filipino safety standards, Filipino wages and conditions being paid to the truck driver behind the wheel of that vehicle. And nor should that be allowed along the Blue Highway if people choose to take freight by sea rather than by road or by rail. We saw this earlier this year with an attempt also to remove cabotage or Australian preference for aviation in Northern Australia. That was abandoned by the government, and they should abandon this too. There are two key sets of evidence before the committee. One, Australian shipping operators saying that they cannot compete and they will be forced to take a foreign flag. Worse is the evidence of Bill Milby. He operates a ship in the Kimberley, True North, and he was advised by a departmental officer to, quote, consider taking our ship True North off the Australian Shipping Register, re-register the ship in a suitable foreign country, lay off our Australian crew and hire a cheaper foreign crew, unquote. This is unconscionable that a senior Australian Infrastructure Department representative who will be quizzed today before that committee has advised an Australian-based company to sack their Australian crew, but importantly to take the Australian flag off the back of that ship. They want to replace the Australian flag on the back of our ships with a white flag when it comes to Australian jobs. This is work choices on water. This will lose Australian jobs and conditions and is ideology gone crazy. Another piece of evidence before the committee concerns Sea Road, a Tasmanian company that have invested $100 million in two ships, a total investment of $200 million based upon the existing legislation. If this current legislation before the House is carried, that investment will be wasted, those jobs and that investment lost to Australia and, importantly, to Tasmania. I call upon the government to abandon this ideological crusade that they have against Australian-based shipping. Happy to take questions.
The government said it didn't provide that advice to Bill Milby, and Warren Truss last week asked doubts of the rational use of the views of the evidence. Are you concerned that ultimately this important debate might come down to Bill Milby's and the cruise lines were against that of Tony Abbott?
No, because you have to look at the facts. The fact is, if you have two ships, one of them with an Australian flag on the back, paying Australian wages and conditions, and the other one with a foreign flag from a flag of convenience, often third world countries with no preconditions whatsoever, paying third world wages, what are the competition implications of that? The policy implications are clear. What industry is saying is very clear, and Bill Milby has the courage to call them out. And he's called them out for calling him a liar. he has very specific dates. In May and June, when he was first given this advice, he travelled here to Canberra, he met with the department and he gave them that advice. And can I say this, as someone who was minister in that department, I know there are people in that department who say it doesn't matter whether there's an Australian shipping industry or not. What matters is just goods being carried around the coast as cheaply as possible. What Bill Milby has done is expose the reality of the advice that he was given, and that advice makes sense with this legislation. That is the logic that this legislation draws you to. It's as simple as that. And Australian companies, if you look at the Australian peak body organisation that has put forward Australian maritime industry, they have said, all of their members, it's consistent with what people have said who've come through the door, but they don't want to say it as publicly as Bill Milby has, but they're all saying exactly the same thing. And common sense tells you the same. If you allowed a foreign truck to go from Sydney to Melbourne with Filipino standards, without any of the safety things that we put on trucks that are registered here, and you allow them to pay a third world truck driving wages and conditions to compete against Linfox, Linfox would go out of business. There'd be implications for safety on our roads, there'd be implications for jobs, there'd be implications outside the industry, just as there are implications, and I refer you to Pashabalka and all the other incidents that have occurred with foreign ships around our coasts. There are incidents beyond just carrying cargo for having a free-for-all around our coasts, as well as national security implications. But that is the logical consequence of what the government's policy position is. And Warren Truss, I'm pleased he woke up for long enough to actually make a statement on this, because he's gone missing.
Is this resonating with anyone in the coalition?
Oh, it certainly is. There are many in the coalition who understand the idea of saying that Australians do not care whether there's an Australian flag presence around our coast and around the world. They understand that. And this is an ideological position. It's a pity people like Paul Neville aren't in this parliament anymore, because Paul Neville was a co-author of the report that was unanimous that led to the existing shipping legislation being in place. This was not partisan legislation. This was worked out over a period of time as a result of a unanimous parliamentary committee. And, you know, for those people in the National Party, for those people in the Liberal Party who care about jobs, they should, just as the crossbenchers have, examine this legislation and reject it.
So the China Free Trade Deal, Albo, the legislation the government says needs to be passed by December, so the tariff cuts still coming from January. Will Labor be supporting the Free Trade Deal, the relevant legislation?
Well, we of course support free trade. We support increased engagement with China. We're simply saying that the government should sit down and do what they say they support. They say they support Australian jobs. They say they support labour market testing to make sure that any jobs that are created out of the free trade agreement, that there's potential for Australian employment before foreign employment is allowed to take those jobs. Let's have a bit of common sense here and let's get a good outcome. I don't think that should be beyond the wit of the government to do, but it's the government that's preferring to play politics with this rather than sit down and have common sense discussions.
Oh, sorry, so if Labor can't get those extra safeguards put into the enabling legislation?
Well, I'm not the Trade Shadow Minister, so I'll leave it to the Trade Shadow Minister. I've stated what our position is. I've stated what my position is very clearly.
Just on the refugee crisis, do you think Labor should put a figure on how many Syrians should be accepted, and should it be this one-off separate allocation sitting outside of the annual intake?
Well, we're not the government, of course, but what Australia should do, and Labor is saying they should do, is take Syrian refugees over and above the existing humanitarian intake. That would be the right thing to do. Tony Abbott can't say we're doing our bit and then in the next sentence say there'll be actually not a single additional refugee taken as a result of a government decision. That's not doing our bit. Have a look at what is going on. This is the largest humanitarian refugee crisis since the Second World War. Our European partners, Germany, are doing an extraordinary amount, and I think that Australia should certainly do more. They should listen to other world leaders, people like Pope Francis and the statements that he's made that are so strong, and do our bit. Anyone who I think has a look at what the situation is knows that we need to do additional, not just say we're going to displace some people and take Syrian refugees in place of people who would have otherwise been accepted here in Australia. And that's consistent with our approach we adopted at the National Conference, where we said we'd take we'd increase the intake. Can I say one thing on the 2-year anniversary of the election of this absolutely hopeless government? When Tony Abbott was elected, he said very clearly that within 1 year there'd be cranes in the sky and bulldozers on major infrastructure projects. He talked a lot about infrastructure prior to the election and in the early stages. You don't hear him talk about infrastructure much at all now. 2 years on, there aren't any bulldozers, there aren't any cranes in the sky, it's just bull dust, that promise of the Prime Minister. Thanks very much.
Good morning.